When you say you know something, what exactly do you mean? How can you separate opinion from fact? Are there things that we simply cannot know? And isn't science unreliable because it's always changing its mind and shifting course? Today in Climate Change Science and Solutions, welcome to Epistemology. We're in section 1, which I call How Do We Know and Why Do We Care? And the first part of this section is going to be the scientific method. Now, the scientific method and humans go way back. In fact, truth-seeking is our family's distinguishing attribute. Let's go back even before Homo sapiens. The early hominids, such as Australopithecus here, were solving problems. Research from Dr. Adrian Bell at the University of Utah shows that as the heads of the babies got bigger, they needed to be born earlier, and so they needed to take care of them for a longer period of time. They invented social mechanisms to take care of one another. Now, this is really important because all species have to adapt to survive, and we don't have, in our family, doesn't have particularly big teeth or sharp claws. What we do have is the ability to observe, learn, and communicate what we've learned. So here's a more recent, or maybe less recent, example of humans solving a problem. Notice this is a Gary Larson cartoon. This end is called the Thagomizer, after the late Thag Simmons. I just learned today that actually on a Stegosaurus, that series of spines is actually called a Thagomizer in science now after this comic. So there have been 100 billion humans that have lived on Earth. And through that time, we've encountered literally millions of different crises. Some of them have almost wiped us out. There was a catastrophe maybe 70,000 or 100,000 years ago that maybe reduced the human population down to only a few thousand. That bottleneck, we can see it in our genes that we all descend from not too many people. So how have we done it? Well, both of these examples could be interpreted as something like trial and error, right? You have a problem, babies that can't take care of themselves for a number of years in some cases, or a larger, better defended animal that's a threat to you. How do you solve that problem? Well, that trial and error plus communication is a very simple form of the scientific method. So I dropped that term in the introduction, epistemology. This is the theory of knowledge. How can we distinguish justified beliefs from baseless opinions? How can we know what is true? And what are the limits of knowledge? Well, if we think about all things that are true as this yellow circle over here on the left, and then we think of what we believe over here in the blue. Now, believe sometimes we only apply to spiritual or religious topics. In fact, in epistemology, a belief is something that someone holds as true. It can be on any topic. Well, there are lots of methods that we use to try to bring our beliefs in line with truths. So much of religion, philosophy, science, art, and many other human activities have as their goal trying to help people understand the world around them. Now they are trying to uncover different parts of truth or using very different methods, but I put forward that is one of the fundamental motivators of all these different activities. So what tools do we have to improve the truth content of our worldview? So there's always going to be some falsehood in there. We're not going to be able to understand all of the truths. But what can we do within our circle of beliefs to increase the percentage of truth? There are two kind of basic approaches that come up again and again and again. The first one is described as empiricism. Now, empiricism assumes that the world is discoverable, meaning that we can observe things. It's possible to understand phenomena around us by observing them. A very complementary approach is described as rationalism. This assumes that the world follows some general rules. So we can use tools like logic and reason to reveal or understand truths that are not observed, that are happening somewhere else, or maybe some that aren't even observable. Things that we may never be able to detect or see, we can explore using these tools. Well, there are a million ways that you could talk about the history of epistemology or knowing. But the thing that I want to get across to you is that it has gone on everywhere. Everywhere where there have been humans, there has been head-scratching and curiosity and trial and error. So it's not just something that happened in ancient Greece, though we sometimes pretend like that's the case. It's not something that just happened in the Middle East. It happened all over the world, every continent, every place where there were people. But really interesting ideas dating back thousands of years, trying to be rigorous, recognizing that while all of us are curious, there also are logical fallacies and ways that we can be led astray. I think this is being recorded in 2021, and we're all keenly aware of the amount of incorrect information that is shared and the large number of patently false beliefs that many people hold. So, empiricism and rationalism, observation and reasoning. Let's go to not too long ago, just 400 years before the Common Era. From that time forward, we started some people started using this term inductivism. Now, inductivism is a really interesting idea. It says that what we observe can be applied sometimes to other places or other systems. So let's look at this picture. These are swans. What do you observe about the swans? What do you see? Are there any commonalities that you see among the swans? All have legs. All have necks. They're all white. All of the swans that we see here are white, and there are quite a few of them, right? We have a pretty good sample size. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14. 14 swans. That's a pretty good sample size. 100% of them are white, right? So we could make a conclusion. Inductively, all of the swans that we've ever seen, and we've seen quite a few, are white. Therefore, all swans are white. That was believed to be true in much of the world until not too long ago, in the grand scheme of things, we learned that there were black swan species. This is a species from Australia. And that it shows the limits of inductive thinking. So we made what seemed to be a very justified assumption. Now, another thing to notice is I counted this swan in our sample size of 14, but in fact, I couldn't see the important part of it that would have tested or disproven our inductive reasoning there. So, inductivism, useful but limited, right? Now, even more recently, just 1,000 years ago or so, there's been a lot of thinking about how can we test the reliability of different levels of inductive thinking. And this philosopher and scientist, Johann, sorry, I don't speak Farsi or Persian, he put forward this idea that competing hypotheses, a hypothesis is an explanation for something you observe. Competing hypotheses can be weighed against each other and compared by how accurate the predictions are that they make. Now that's a really interesting idea. It's also a little bit hard to understand. So let's use an example from Belgium. I love Belgium. This is a man named Johannes Baptist van Helmont, Flemish-speaking chemist and doctor from what is now Belgium. Belgium wasn't created until 1830, so he was a really important thinker. In fact, he coined the word gas for the type of matter that exists around us. It came from the Greek word for chaos. He was really interested in understanding how the natural world worked, and he was a very careful observer. And he used controlled experimentation to test different hypotheses about how the world worked. The advantage of an experiment is that you can eliminate some sources of distraction or complicating factors. Also, when you manipulate something, when you are controlling the dials, that is really powerful at establishing causality. What caused what? Not just what happened at the same time as what. So let's look at what Johannes Baptist von Helmont did. This comes directly from his manuscript, his report on his experiment, though it was originally in Flemish, I believe, or Latin, who knows. For I took an earthen vessel in which I put 200 pounds of earth that had been dried in a furnace, which I moistened, that's how it was written, with rainwater, and I implanted therein the trunk or stem of a willow tree, weighing 5 pounds. And lest the dust that flew about should be commingled with the earth, I covered the lip or mouth of the vessel with an iron plate, covered with tin, and easily passable with many holes. I computed not the weight of the leaves that fell off in the 4 autumns. Really cool and quite efficient description of his experiment. He wants to know what are plants made of. Plants, unlike animals, you can't see them eating something. They don't have a mouth. So he was really interested, where do they get their mass from? And he put a willow stem in a pot that was enclosed, and he dried out the soil so he knew how much soil was there, and then he covered it with metal all around so that the leaves and dust and other things couldn't fall in. Then he let it grow. And this is a good example of how sometimes it takes long-term experiments to answer important questions. He had to wait 5 years. And after 5 years, he pulled the tree out, shook all of the soil off very carefully to make sure that it was all there, weighed the soil, and also weighed the tree. And he found that remember, there was 200 pounds of earth, 5 pounds of willow. He found that the tree that sprung forth weighed 169 pounds. And, let's read it here. At length, I again dried the earth of the vessel, drum roll, and there were found the same 200 pounds wanting about 2 ounces. There was only 2 ounces of lost material. First of all, hats off. That is a really high precision experiment. Didn't lose very much soil, was able to have a very precise measurement of what was there. So he concluded that 164 pounds of wood, bark, and root arose out of water only, because the only thing that he had seen that was added to the experiment was water, right? He watered that tree over and over and over again. So he made a conclusion that the tree must be made of water. Now, a really interesting hypothesis. Does that match up with your understanding of what plants are made of? Here, I love his kind of self-satisfied conclusion here. This is a picture of the mannequin piss, a very famous and underwhelming fountain in Brussels. But I have learned by this handicraft operation, that all vegetables do immediately and materially proceed out of the element of water only. So he had a question, designed an experiment, and then came to a conclusion. Now, in this case, the conclusion was partially wrong. Not completely, but partially wrong. What are plants made up of primarily? Carbon. Where does that carbon come from? The atmosphere. There was part of his experiment which he didn't control. However, he learned something really important. The predominant theory at the time was that plants were soil eaters, that the roots of the plants absorbed the soil and then built their bodies out of the soil. He definitively disproved that hypothesis, and he concluded something that was wrong, but the data that he collected was correct, and it was very valuable and helped them advance their understanding. So most of this is still what we think of as the modern scientific method. Actually, von Helmont was in the group that was helping to create a formal scientific method, but there's really important characters, the 2 Bacons of the modern scientific method. Roger Bacon, who was a Franciscan monk in the 13th century in England, and this, by the way, is an important thing to bring up. We sometimes assume that there is an inherent and long-standing animosity between religion and science. This literally could not be farther from the truth. If you look back at those slides, you'll see that most or many of those individuals were actually sponsored by, supporters of, and most of them were believers in various religions. Science and religion have worked together. Unfortunately, there are people on both sides who strike up fights with the others, which I find really counterproductive. But in this case, Roger Bacon was a full-on monk, so living a religious lifestyle, and because of that monk lifestyle, he had lots of time. He put forward this idea of observation, followed by hypothesis, that's trying to figure out an explanation, experimentation, and independent verification. That's a really important step. This idea of not only taking my word for it, as LaVere Burton says, but getting somebody else to test your conclusions. Now, Francis Bacon, more recently, 17th century in England, was the Attorney General. Well done, Francis Bacon. And I love this quote, "If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties." So important for several reasons. First, it's very poetic and nice. Second of all, we need to be careful about the assumptions and beliefs that we have going into something. So von Helmont believed there were only two possible outcomes. Plants could be soil eaters or they could be water eaters. And those were the only two possibilities. If he had been more broad thinking and had started with doubts, started with questioning, then maybe he would have identified, oh, this also could have come from the air, which he was familiar with because of other experiments. Now, Francis Bacon also used this method called eliminative induction. It was a rational procedure to establish causation, and I really like it because it was a simple table. He would make a table and say, okay, if we see plants growing, what are the things that we always see when plants are growing? Water is one of those, but also sunlight and air, soil or some kind of substrate for the plants to grow on. Most plants, not all. Also a table of deviation or absence in proximity. That's a really important one. So think back to our swan example. All it takes is one swan that's not white to disprove that hypothesis, that induction that all swans were white. So that is a point of deviation. And the old phrase, the exception proves the rule. Prove, that's the original older sense, to test or to probe. And so when we see an exception, it's really important not to just say, oh, that's weird. Even though many times our minds are looking for patterns and so they don't see the exception, we need to notice the exception and then ask ourselves, what does this mean for what I've concluded about the world around me? And then, like the others, Francis Bacon was really interested in crucial experiments. That means something that will actually test. If you have an idea of what's going on, manipulate the system in some way. Push it or prod it or water it or cut off the air. See what happens. Now, in the 20th century, one of the most important scientific philosophers is Karl Popper. And he came up with the term which we still use to describe the modern scientific method, the hypothetico-deductive framework. It's very scientific because it has a hyphen in the name. The important aspects of this framework, you'll notice it's not fundamentally different than some of the previous ideas, but it's an iterative, meaning you do it over and over again, combination of inductive and deductive methods. So sometimes we look down on induction because it can't ever establish truth absolutely. Sometimes we look down on deduction because it's getting narrower and narrower and narrower. It's hard to draw general conclusions from it. The scientific method takes both of those and goes round and round and round. Very, very powerful. So induction is the extrapolation of ideas, moving from a specific case to a general case. We infer a general rule from a limited number of observations. Deductive is the elimination of possible explanations. We're going to move from general premises and ideas to specific observations. We're zooming in on what we can know with certainty, what's within our observations. And one of Popper's really important contributions was a clear definition of what science was. In his opinion, empirical falsifiability distinguishes science from non-science. So we know those terms now, right? At least the first one, empirical, meaning observations. Falsifiability means it could potentially be proven wrong. So what Popper said was, science is only that which can be disproven. So there's some claims, which may be true or not, that cannot be disproven. For example, is something beautiful? Now, beautiful is a subjective normative concept. We're pretty familiar with that, and most people accept that. So whether something is beautiful or not cannot definitively be tested with science. Though there are people that have looked at what do people find as beautiful, right? That is falsifiable. You can take an image and ask thousands or even millions of different people whether they think it's beautiful or not, right? That is collecting data. You could potentially prove or disprove that. Now, likewise with many issues of personal meaning or connection with deity or supernatural or things that we can't yet observe, right? If we cannot empirically evaluate it, then it's not within the grasp of science. And that's really important. Likewise, moral questions, what is right and wrong? Science simply cannot answer those questions for us. We have to use different ways of discovering truth. Now, also I'll point out the fact that empirical falsification is inherently asymmetrical. So I just added some other long words to that one, but you can disprove a hypothesis by making an observation. All it takes is one black swan to disprove that hypothesis. But you can never definitively prove a hypothesis. They can only be supported by the evidence that we have so far. So that's really important. Science is an open door. We're always looking for new data, and very often there are changes in our understanding when we have new ways of looking at the world. Think about the Hubble telescope as an obvious example. Once that was there, we could test all kinds of hypotheses that had been beyond the realm of science before. So this really is quite philosophical. A really important historian and philosopher of science, Naomi Oreskes, who still is alive, has looked at the whole enterprise of science, not only individuals, but how does science function in communities when you're talking about hundreds, thousands, or even millions of researchers who are trying to answer questions. I love her description of the communal scientific enterprise is organized skepticism. So skepticism is when you're not immediately accepting a claim, you're skeptical of it. And here are the general ideas. The scientific community is multiple independent individuals and groups that are checking or falsifying each other. They're trying to disprove one another initially, and then if they find the same thing, then they will build on that. They'll take that experiment. So when penicillin was discovered, other groups tried the same experiment. They grew that fungus in a petri dish. They looked at how it influenced bacteria. When they saw, sure enough, that it was a powerful antibiotic, they began using it as well. So these independent groups are going to help correct for some of that bias that can creep in, even the best intentioned. Public, private, and independent researchers are applying contrasting and complementary methods to make new observations, hypotheses, and theories. So really cool. It's not only government funded, it's not only privately funded, it's not only industry, but it's all of those groups working together. Also, very often, everyday citizens make important contributions to science. So even though we're not definitively proving things in the Popperian sense, through time, this community of organized skepticism generates a highly reliable understanding of the world, remarkably reliable within that realm. It allows us to cure diseases, build devices, including this incredible network that you're looking at right now, these devices right here in my office that are recording this, and discover truths. So you're going to likely encounter people that believe that science is perfectly objective and every study is the gospel truth. You're going to encounter people that say exactly the opposite, that science is just a bunch of hacks that are saying what they want to, and they're using this expertise to control us and dominate us, even though there's no real truth in it. Neither of those views are correct. What is true is science has an amazing record, and it isn't this extreme view. There was there's an idea that science is always being overturned. Now, some fields are. In fact, the field of nutrition, which is an area of great interest to the public, is a very unreliable science because it's difficult to control what people eat, what they do. So you'll see every few months or a couple years, coffee is good for you, coffee is bad for you, wine is good for you, just 1 glass or 2 glasses, wine is bad for you in any amount, right? That is the case for nutritional science, a relatively unreliable field currently, unfortunately. However, if you look at the broader flavors of science, many of them have been extremely stable, and after these ideas are settled and accepted, they become a building block, and then we can move higher and understand farther and farther and farther. So I hope that you're just feeling as amazed as I am. Isn't it just super exciting? And then I love this Nathan Pyle's descriptions. He takes these alien characters and has them describe literally what we as humans do. So this young alien is saying, I have attempted science. And the judge says, please explain. I've formed an idea and then I discovered I was wrong. There are numerous diagrams. I was wrong in numerous ways. I produced a detailed tribute to my wrongness. That is science. I think it's really beautiful. And the fact that we're not afraid of being proven wrong. In fact, we're grateful when we're proven wrong because that will allow us to move and investigate a more fruitful avenue, is one of the things that makes science so powerful. So let's go back to these circles. Before, I just had the truths and beliefs. Now you'll notice I made the belief circle a little bit bigger. Hopefully our beliefs are growing in the truth direction. But there are actually 2 cases here. You can have things that you're right about just accidentally, right? You had to pick a view. Maybe you believe Bigfoot exists. Maybe you believe Bigfoot doesn't. I don't know. We don't have any strong evidence that Bigfoot does exist, but could be. So we could accidentally be wrong or right on that. Knowledge is a belief that is true for which we have strong evidence. And of course, strong evidence is a subjective term, but means that we have multiple observations that are supporting that view. So the goal, I think this is a helpful thing. We're not just trying to move our beliefs around in every way. We're trying to learn how to identify evidence, learn how to make observations, learn how to compare and contrast different claims, so that we can grow that beautiful orange circle in the middle and move our overall beliefs over on the truth side. But the lines are not as clear as they appear here in this little overlapping diagram, right? There are different levels of understanding. And this is some crucial terminology. Observations are the material. They are the raw material of science. In fact, Naomi Oreskes says, while there's this huge amount of diversity in various scientific approaches, not all of them are forming formal hypotheses. Some of them are just out testing things, trial and error style. Some of them are very theoretical. What is common among all of them is evidence. We're making observations. So those observations can be qualitative, meaning that we didn't make it with a number. We can't assign a specific value to it, but we can still learn from it. Or they can be quantitative. They have a specific value. When we make enough observations, we start to come up with explanations for them, hypotheses. And a hypothesis is very often based on multiple observations. It's explaining what we see. If that hypothesis, the predictions that it makes turn out to be true, over and over and over again, multiple times, we sometimes will graduate that hypothesis into a theory. Theory is the highest level of scientific understanding. The things that we're most sure of, we call a theory. So do you know any scientific theories? Think about classes that you've taken or books you've read. The theory of gravity. We have a very strong understanding that gravity exists, and we're learning more and more about how it works. But we've been able to send spaceships to the moon because of how strong that theory is, right? The theory of evolution, the central concept in biology, understanding how species react to the environment around them and compete with each other, help each other, and change through time, through natural and artificial selection. Really, really powerful, strong, supported by thousands of hypotheses, millions of observations. So this pyramid here is something of a problem, because in normal everyday language, a theory is a sign. When we call something a theory, that's very pejorative. That's saying that we're not really sure about it. That's just a theory, right? So this is a problem when we're talking about these scientific theories. We need to make sure and communicate with those that aren't familiar with scientific terminology that actually means something strong, like a law. Something that we're very, very certain of. Now, we try to always be intellectually humble in science, and that's why we avoid terms like prove or know. But a theory, for all intents and purposes, is proven. It is known. Now, I quite like this version of the scientific method from Wikipedia, because it emphasizes how it is an iterative process that you do over and over again. And you can start at any point in this. So you're going to make some observations. What do I see? Think about questions. Formulate explanations for what you're seeing. This is a really important one. For it to be scientific, it has to be disprovable, falsifiable, right? So we develop testable predictions, then gather data, run experiments, do things, and then we refine, alter, expand, or reject the hypothesis. And sometimes we can go round and round and round and round and round and round here for decades or centuries before we're satisfied that we understand it well enough to graduate it to a theory. That theory very likely is going to lead to breakthroughs in technology and understanding and lead to new observations. So it is never done, but it's extremely powerful. So there are a few terms here: prediction, hypothesis, test. Let's look at that, because this is really the heart of the nuts and bolts of the scientific method. So a hypothesis is an explanation for something you have observed. It is the mechanism behind a pattern. This one's helpful. It always involves a because. Now, not necessarily the word because, but there has to be an explanation. Not only what did you see or what did you expect, but why did you expect that? What is causing that? And thinking back to Francis Bacon, we should always identify multiple hypotheses, trying to avoid being overly swayed and only looking for plants either eating soil or eating water. We should be thinking about all the different possibilities. Now, if you have a hypothesis, it's going to generate multiple predictions. A prediction is the expected pattern if the hypothesis is true. So if animals have stripes so that they can blend in with each other, that's a legitimate hypothesis, then we should expect to see stripes more in animals that are social, that live with each other, right? That's an expected pattern. The prediction is animals that are social will more likely to be striped if my explanation for stripes is correct, that animals are striped, they can blend in with each other. Now, anybody think of some striped animals? Zebras, of course. Tigers. Zebras are very social. Tigers are not. Dang it. And in fact, we see stripes in all kinds of different animals. Now, that hypothesis could be true in some cases, but it's not the sole cause, right? I can say that just because of the observations that I've made from my childhood wasted watching a lot of TV. Not wasted. I love nature shows. So, in fact, there now are multiple hypotheses. Some of them have a lot of evidence, including that stripes discourage parasites. So it's difficult for a fly to figure out where to land. It doesn't recognize the form of a zebra when it sees those stripes. And flies and parasites affect all animals. And so that is more plausible, right? It matches the hypothesis more. Now, a single hypothesis can generate many predictions, right? So saying that animals are blending in with each other, and therefore we should only see it with social animals. Now there are many other predictions that we could make from that, and it's really important to make multiple predictions, because how sure you are should depend on how much evidence is supporting and not supporting that conclusion. So hypothesis is the explanation, prediction is the expected pattern if true. The test is the experiment or data gathering activity that lets you see if your predictions are true. Let's bring this into the real world. And we'll do hypothesis or prediction. People that eat Cheerios are happier. Who says this is a hypothesis? Who says it's a prediction? People that eat Cheerios are happier. So it's saying that those two things coincide, but it's not telling us why. It's not even necessarily, it's kind of implied, but it's not necessarily telling us which one's associated with what, right? So that's, in my opinion, a prediction. Now, what about this? Cheerios make us healthier because of their high cobalt content. That's giving us an explanation for why the Cheerios are influencing mood, because of cobalt. I don't actually know if Cheerios have cobalt in them, but hopefully not. So you could generate multiple predictions from that hypothesis, saying other foods that are high in cobalt should also be associated with happiness. If I took the cobalt out of Cheerios and fed it to people, those people shouldn't have the same happiness effect. That's going to isolate if maybe it's the circular shape or the fact of taking a minute to take a break that increases happiness. Denitrification is correlated with nitrate concentration at catchment scales. Fancy. Even if you don't know most of these words, you can evaluate whether it's a hypothesis or prediction. So who says it's a hypothesis? Who says it's a prediction? I think that this is a prediction. The term is correlated with just simply says that they occur at the same time or in the same place. It doesn't indicate why. It doesn't indicate that cause. This phrase, however, denitrification controls nitrate concentration at catchment scales. You may not be able to see it, but the controls tells us what is causing what. This process, which is a microbial process that removes reactive nitrogen and turns it into inert air or nitrous oxide, it is controlling the nitrate form of nitrogen at catchment scales for watersheds. So that is a hypothesis. You then could go out, make predictions, and test those predictions. Sarah's dad was sick and didn't come to work. Who says that that is a hypothesis? Who says that's a prediction? Now there's no because, right? The word because. But it seems to strongly imply that the reason why he didn't come to work was because he was sick. So I actually would say this isn't a scientifically phrased hypothesis, but I actually think this is a statement of hypothesis. It's not just telling us that he didn't come to work, but it's telling us why. Hope that your dad gets better, Sarah. Global temperature is higher when CO2 is higher. Who says that's a hypothesis? Who says that's a prediction? This is similar to that correlation. It's a prediction. It's not telling us which one is controlling which or why, but simply that they co-occur. CO2 influences global temperature via the greenhouse effect. We now have causality. The CO2 is controlling the global temperature, and we have an explanation for how it's doing it. The greenhouse effect is doing that. Now, thank you for going this far in the lecture. It's difficult to kind of keep your focus. And so I encourage you can pause this video, come back to it at another time. The important thing is that you're paying attention, that you're thinking about this, and that you're noting down any of the ideas that you're not understanding so that we can talk about them more. Come in during office hours, post a question on Slack, or ask during class. So just a couple more things to look at. I think that there's a fabulous demonstration of the scientific method in the Book of Mormon. This is a section of scripture from Alma, one of the long books in the middle of the Book of Mormon. And in this parable, we have a likening of knowledge and truth to a seed. And I'm not going to read the whole thing here, but I encourage you to go back and look at it through the lens of the modern scientific method and try to identify these different components, the different steps. It's also interesting that this is the only place that I know of in the scriptures where we have this word experiment. But so there's a question. The question is, are these words that are being taught by Amulek and Alma true? Really important, clear question. Then there's a hypothesis. Because seeds bring forth fruit of their own likeness, following correct teachings will result in an expanded soul, enlightenment, and happiness. So these seeds are going to cause an increase of light, truth, and happiness, an increase in ability to do good. Then there are this prediction. If the seed is good, then it will grow. It's going to bring those positive outcomes. If it's bad, this would be implied, then it's not going to do that. So the word, the claim, the teaching, the practice is the seed, and then we're going to experiment with it to see what it brings. The test is the hard part, making room for the words and cherishing the words, right? So think back to Johannes von Helmont's experiment. It wasn't enough just to plant that willow. He had to actually water it and tend it and make sure that it could grow so that he could learn how it was working. And then the conclusion, if the seed does grow and cause an expansion of the soul, then we know that that is a true teaching. Also important that there is some interpretation, including what are the implications and what are the limitations of this. And so you'll notice that it's not enough just to do a half-hearted test. You're not going to be able to know definitively. But one of the things that it mentions is that good seeds can die if not cared for. So the experiment can fail. We need to be humble. Just because we tried something and it didn't bring out that outcome doesn't mean that it's necessarily a perfect test, right? We are complex, and the scientific method requires replication, just simply because things can go wrong or there can be an unexpected factor. Also, just because we tested one thing, we grew one seed, we tested one word, does not mean that we can know or conclude that all words, even if they're in the same book or in the same verse of Scripture, we can't conclude that all of those words and concepts are true. It's very specific that we only know in that thing. And we still need to exercise our rational thinking, also our faith. The faith is what allows us to actually, or gives us the motivation to undertake that experiment. So again, there's no conflict in my mind between faith and belief in religious and spiritual truths and scientific truths. In fact, there's a lot of similarity and commonality, though you'll notice that we're not using machines or statistical tests to evaluate our personal lives. That's not a very reliable or good way because we don't have good replication at the individual level. We're using more qualitative tools here. So in summary, the scientific method, science itself is defined by what we can disprove, empirical falsifiability. Is there a chance that evidence could disprove our belief? If yes, then it could fall within the realm of science. If no, then it does not. We call this modern scientific method the hypothetico-deductive approach or framework. Theory is the highest level of knowing, followed by hypothesis, followed by observation, the raw material for science. And the hypotheses explain patterns. They're not, I went to a, sorry, this is an aside. I went to a presentation by Google at my daughter's school one time where they said, hypothesis is what you expect to happen. No, that's wrong. But you probably have heard that. I did when I was in elementary school and high school as well. But a hypothesis is an explanation for the pattern that you see. And the scientific method is iterative. You have to do it over and over again. It also is subjective, right? When you have a single study that comes out, we should be skeptical of that one study until it has been evaluated, tested by multiple groups. And then, after multiple groups have concluded the same thing, and there is a high level of consensus in the community, then it's extremely reliable and powerful. So people that often will criticize science, they are falling subject to what we call one study syndrome. So they've found one study, very often they've cherry-picked the one study that had evidence in the direction that they wanted to believe in the first place. Or they could pick a study in the other direction and say, oh no, look, science said, this one study that I found said that masks are ineffective at stopping the spread of respiratory diseases. What we need to really do is look at the consensus in the community, and also recognize when there isn't consensus, when you have lots of diverse opinions, then the science may not be there yet, right? May not be ready. That doesn't mean that the scientific process is unreliable. It means that it takes focus, it takes time, it takes critical thinking. Thank you very much for watching to the end. I really enjoy working with you, and until next time, stay epistemological.
Warming weather, melting ground, fruitless hunting, swimming round and round, dissolution of your home, of all you've loved and all that you've known.